Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι ο Τάκης Καρκάνας, Διευθυντής του Εργαστηρίου Αρχαιολογικών Επιστημών Malcolm Wiener της Αμερικανικής Σχολής Κλασικών Σπουδών στην Αθήνα και σας καλωσορίζω στη σημερινή ετήσια διάλεξη του εργαστηρίου μας. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά για να προλογίσω και τον ομιλητή μας, την ομιλητριά μας. Good evening and thank you all for joining us for the annual lecture of the Malcolm H. Wiener Laboratory for Archaeological Science of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. My name is Takis Karkanas and I am the director of the Wiener Lab. It's an honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Natalie Monroe, who is one of the leading scholars in the field of zooarchaeology. Monroe is currently a professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona. She began her studies in Southern Methodist University, initially majoring in biology due to her interest in ecology. However, she later switched her major to anthropology after developing a passion for archaeology, ultimately specializing in zooarchaeology. Monroe earned her master's degree from Simon Fraser University and her PhD from University of Arizona. From 2001 to 2002, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian Institution. She was a fellow at the University of Connecticut's Humanities Institute in 2015-2016, and she also served as a visiting professor at the Mandel Skollion Center for Interdisciplinary Research at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem from 2017-2018. Monroe studies animal bone remains to understand why humans settled and gradually shifted towards agriculture and animal domestication. She connects large archaeological databases from individual sites to explore broader evolutionary themes such as human population dynamics, animal domestication, sedentarization, and the emergence of public ritual practices on a regional scale. She's interested in reconstructing human diets, and she has also investigated early fishing practices, community organization, sharing behaviors, and hygiene. Her research primarily examines the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agrarian ones, particularly in Israel, Turkey, and Greece. Her research is published widely in peer-reviewed journals such as Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, Current Anthropology, and the Journal of Human Evolution. I would like, in particular, to mention her seminal work at Franchthi Cave in Peloponnese, which was published in the journals Current Anthropology, Journal of Human Evolution, and Quaternary International. Her research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and the Wiener Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research. She has served as an associate editor for the Journal of Human Evolution and is a long-term co-chair and member of the board of the Connecticut Museum of Natural History. Currently, she is a member of the Wiener Lab Committee, part of the Managing Committee of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Tonight, Monroe will discuss the emergence and spread of animal management in the Eastern Mediterranean, a very interesting topic, I believe, that we'll all look forward to hearing about. So please join me in welcoming Natalie.
Hello and good evening, and many thanks to you all for coming to hear my lecture this evening. I'm looking forward to telling you about many of the things that Takis just talked to you about in terms of my larger research program. I really am interested in this broader question of the beginning of settled communities, agricultural communities, and I'm interested over the, 30 years of my career and looking at it from a number of different directions, from before the time that it begins, from the actual process of it happening, to the movement and spread of agriculture afterwards. So today what I would like to do is I'd like to sort of put all of those themes together. I hope I'm not going to overdo it, and tell you a little bit about those stories from the different places where I've worked over the years, and give you sort of an up-to-date picture, at least on how I see some of the important themes that are related to the beginning, especially tonight. I'm going to talk about the beginning of what I would call animal management, or otherwise known in its later forms as animal domestication, especially of sheep and goat. So the emergence of sedentary and agricultural communities has been a theme, an important theme in archaeological research for more than a century. It's the impacts and the changes that it wrought on society are just so enormous that it's fascinated people, even since the 1800s. People have been working on this question. And a lot of the themes that have been really popular in the story have been sort of related to a core-periphery theme, especially in the last, 75 years, maybe, let's say. Southwest Asia, the area I work with, the Eastern Mediterranean, is an area where we have the earliest dates for the beginning of animal domestication, and so it's been a particularly dynamic area. And over the years, we've accumulated much data from a variety of different sites, and as we do so, it's really kind of changed the way we see the picture over time. So just to give you a little bit of background, I mentioned core-periphery stories that have really been important for the better part of 100 years, though more recently we see changes away from this, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But sort of the best known of these models, I think, came out around the turn of the millennium. And basically, this concept suggests that there's a sort of one core region, which is focused mostly in southern Anatolia and the northern Levant, the Euphrates region, where we have all of the major domesticates. So we have the cattle, the sheep, the pig, and the goats for the animals, and wheat, barley, lentils, peas, etc. for plants. And the idea is that agriculture or domestication of both plants and animals happened quite rapidly in this area, that it was quite intentional, and that once it became established, it gradually moved out from this area into other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, and then beyond to Europe, to Africa, and other parts of the world. However, more recently, in the last, let's say, I would say 20, 25 years, there's been a lot of movement away from this narrative, especially thanks to the work of folks who've been working on the question of plant domestication. And they've noted and proposed a more multivariate kind of scenario, or a multi-regional kind of scenario that embraces more localized variability in the process, a wider geographical range of, a regional range of origins and beginnings, more variability in the process itself, long time frames, and basically quite a different scenario that suggests that it might have arisen in many different places over long periods of time. And that sometimes it started, sometimes it stopped, sometimes we have dead ends, etc. The animal part of the story, with plants, it's a little bit different than how this has trickled in with animals, but with animals, it's also become a more common theme in animal domestication research. People have really been focusing more recently on different areas for origins of domestication and getting away and moving away from this sort of primary core area theme, though I think when we still look at overviews, when people publish, the current status, for example, on the research in the region, those themes are still trickling in on a regular basis. And I'm quite interested in this question, and especially about this idea of multi-regional scenarios, especially because of the fact that I work in areas that are out of that area. So I've been looking at that picture from a different perspective for a long time. So I think one of the things that's really important is that we have to sort of shift our scale, or we have to shift back and forth between different scales. One is we have to look very carefully in the local scale. We need high quality, well-preserved sites with very detailed excavation strategies to get the kind of data we need to look very, very carefully, ideally over long time spans or time sequences. We can't always get what we want from the archaeological record. Usually we don't. So it's unusual when we actually find a site that allows us to do that, and I'll give you one example of that today. So it's really important that we sort of drill down at this and think about the microscale processes that ultimately are really responding to local factors. Why at this point in time, did they start domesticating or managing or keeping or confining goats where they weren't really doing very much domestication of plants, for example? Or why in this area did they start doing this at a certain time and not in other areas? So we have to really not only look at the story from the plants and animals, but of course also from the archaeological context. And we need to do that, I think, by also looking at the very beginning of the story, or that emergence part, at a time that's tricky to get at because of the fact that the animals at that point in time look like wild animals. So if you're just digging up animal bones and analyzing them, on first glance, they look just like wild animals. So how do we know when the relationship with humans changes? How do we detect that? What kind of clues could we look for? Those are things that we really need to focus on if we really want to get the time depth to really understand the larger picture of the beginning of animal management and domestication. I'm not going to talk about this slide, all the details. I just want to give you the idea that we also have to look at multiple lines of evidence. And I think actually this is exactly sort of the purview of the Wiener lab, right? This is what they're doing there, is looking with very detailed techniques, micro techniques in many cases, scientific techniques, at problems from many, many directions, and getting things and gaining new knowledge that we can't necessarily see with the naked eye, but is definitely present if we have the right scenarios where we can look at it. So what I'm going to do today then is I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my research program. My research programs from Central Anatolia, from the southern Levant, and from the Peloponnese of Greece, to sort of look at this problem at different scales. And then I'll try to put some of those themes together with what I've introduced at the beginning. But I also want to say how important it is that this story that I'm going to tell is very much an interdisciplinary story. These are all projects I've been involved with, but they're absolutely dependent on many, many, many colleagues, and I'll put on a long acknowledgement list at the end. Many of these are collaborations. Sometimes we've independently collected data and put it together, but other times it's been very close interactions with not only zooarchaeologists, but many other specialists, project directors, etc. So when I talk about this research, it's involving like a huge amount of work by a huge amount of people. So I'm going to start by talking about a case that I think is really it's an excellent example of really what we could call a local story of animal management. I'm going to look specifically at Central Anatolia and the two sites of Ashukla, Huyuk, and Balikla. And these two sites are really important because they're actually located very close together, and they're absolutely contemporaneous, but they're very different from one another. One of them is a tell, where we see long-term trajectory of change over 1,000 years, where the other one is a much shorter-lived site, even though the two sites were literally 14 kilometers apart. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the first of those cases, and then we'll look at the other case of Balikla, and to get an idea about how things can vary locally on quite a tremendous scale, and how important it is to understand that, especially at this particular moment in time. So the site of Ashukla Huyuk is located in Cappadocia in Turkey, and you can, the site is a tell site, so it's about 10 meters or so in height. And here I've shown you a picture of oops, sorry, I knew I was going to do that eventually. The lower levels here, where you see more round kind of structures with open spaces between them. This is at the very bottom of the tell, as opposed to the very top, where you have contiguous above room structures made of wattle and daub that are located very close together at a time where people started to actually do their outdoor work on the rooftops. So we have really a beautiful sequence of the trajectory of change of this community from the top to the bottom, and it's beautifully preserved. So you can even see the layers and some of the bricks in the side of the tell here from this view. The site was excavated for about 20 years by Ufuk Esen of Istanbul University, and she focused primarily on the top layers of the site. Hilke Boutenhaus, who is a zooarchaeologist, made arguments for proto-domestication of sheep and goat at the site, based on their culling profiles. And down here at the bottom, we have dates that go as old as about 8,400 years ago. And what happened is that after they finished sort of paying very detailed attention to the top layers, they sunk a sounding into the side of the tell, and they quickly sort of went down to close to the bottom layers. And at about that time, in about 2010, Miraban Ashbazaran and Güneş Duru, then of Istanbul University, took over as directors of this project when Esin retired, and they instigated a very rigorous scientific program of research with many specialists to look in more detail at the story of change across the tell. So I'm going to show you some data from the animals. And I'm going to start with this graph, which is just a nice overview from top to bottom of the tell of the main species that are located there. And the main message I want you to take home is what's happening here in these darker bars, which represent the sheep and the goat. Okay, and what you see is at the bottom of the tell, they're there, but they're not very common. Okay, they're only representing about 30% of the entire assemblage. But as we move up, they become increasingly more common until we get to the top, where we have more or less a complete trade-off of animals here, where we have about 90% of caprines. The goats at the top and the sheep at the top look like the ones at the bottom. They look wild in terms of their morphology, but it's clear that there's been a dramatic change that's happened here in the relationship between humans and these animals. In the earlier layers, we also have a lot of small prey like hares and fish, okay? But you can see that as things change, they really drop out. They're still there, but their importance diminishes as caprines take on a more important role. And so we wanted to dive more carefully into the sheep and the goat part of the story and look at how their culling profiles change. And what I mean by their culling profiles is, at what age were they being killed by humans? And we have some common understanding in zooarchaeology that generally, when people are raising animals for meat, they tend to behave in a way that's, to make production more or less efficient. Not always true, but often true. And so they tend to cull the males early. They kill them before they reach adulthood, because once they become full size, they no longer, you're just putting more investment into them. You're feeding them, but they're not getting any bigger. And you don't need more than a few of them to maintain the herd. The females are a different story because they're reproducers, so you allow them to live into adulthood. So when you get a managed herd, you expect to see a lot more juveniles. What's interesting about the very early layers at Ashuklohik is that you have a huge number of very young animals. You have two peaks in these graphs, very young animals. These are like between 6 and 18 months. And you have another peak that comes in later, which are the adults. Okay, so what we think, and I will give you some more evidence for why we think this in a minute, is that early on, we have more of what is likely a catch and grow strategy. People are capturing young animals, lambs, and they're raising them for a few months, probably live on the hoof, and then they're culling them before winter or for a special event, okay? So we see they only have the young ones. It doesn't look like any reproduction is taking place on site because we don't have an adult population. But that population starts to grow through time, and we see suggestion that we have start to get potentially reproduction on site as we move forward. The reason that we can really think of these as management strategies, like I just described for the profiles, is because we found a lot of other really important information that shows that these animals were being managed by humans. And this is evidence for confinement, and it comes in a couple of different forms. One of those is the presence of animal dung, which is visible in the archaeological record in the form of calcium or calcareous deposits that are formed in the guts of many ruminant species called spherulites. They look like this. And also the presence of phytoliths, which are things from the stems of plants that are eaten by animals. And they, if you find these in concentrations, they could be, for example, in this layer, this is a huge concentration of animal dung. It's extremely rich in spherulites and phytoliths. you can learn that you're actually dealing with huge deposits of animal dung that are going way beyond what you would expect if people were collecting dung from the fields or from wild animals for fuel. So in the bottom layers, we have some thin deposits, and you can see these laminated micromorphological deposits here, where you have bedding of animal dung, basically, that have formed over and over and over again in the same locations. So we have nice evidence, for dung. And then we also have another study that when they were looking at the micromorphological thin section, Susan Menser was doing this work, she observed these deposits of salts. Okay, they look just like salts that you might see deposited in a variety of different places. And they started to look at these more closely in the the sodium, the chlorides, and the nitrates. And these are common salts that are formed in urine, both human urine and animal urine. And so because the site is so well preserved, they started sampling all over the tell to find out how much urine was really there, how much was really deposited, and what would you even expect from how much urine would you even expect to be deposited on a tell like this over the amount of time that it was used. And what they noted is that the salts, okay, these gray bars at the bottom are the amounts that you found in the sterile layers where there's no human occupation beneath, and these are the amounts that you see increasing steadily through the layers. And this is actually an exponential scale. So when it's increasing exponentially. So there's a lot more urine being deposited in the site as we move up the tell. And this is something that's way beyond the scale in their models of what you could expect from humans. So we have not only evidence for animal dung, but evidence for a lot of animal urine on site, showing that there was animal keeping on site. And the final line of evidence that we have for confinement, which is a really nice one, was done by a study by the Munich team of zooarchaeologists on our site. Michaela Zimmerman was the leading author. This was her dissertation research on the joint health of the animals. So when we were looking at the straguli, one of our colleagues noted that there were these pathologies on the joints. So you can see them in these little circles here. They get quite large here, these little holes. And this bone is from the ankle. Okay, so what Michaela did was she went and she found museum collections that had confined animals and free-ranging animals, and she looked for those pathologies in those collections, and what she found was that the confined animals had much more severe levels of pathologies over here on the right side of the graph than the free-ranging populations in the blue, which you find in the wild populations. And she looked at then the Ashukla data, okay, going from bottom to top, and found that their profile was a much closer match for these confined populations in terms of the amount and intensity of the pathologies that they have on their joints than in the others. So when we put all this evidence together, we have a really nice picture of a change in the percentage of animals. We have a really nice evidence for also for confinement, and we see that this changes as we move up the tell. So all the lines of evidence, and there are even others that I haven't even spoken of isotope evidence, genetic evidence for these herds and their local origin, indicates that these is really an endemic process of domestication. And this is exciting because this is also early. It's around, let's say, it's getting going. We already know at the beginning they're already confining them at the very earliest levels. Okay, so let's say 8,300 or so, which is contemporaneous more or less with what we see in southeastern Anatolia. And also we see that this is happening in situ, right? It's happening there and it's local. So this really changes sort of the way we think about animal management, because Central Anatolia has not traditionally been viewed as a part of this core area. It's quite far outside, in fact. So this is a nice story. In Balikla, the site that I said was nearby, the one that's less intensively occupied, things look quite different. And this site was discovered in 2017 by Nigel Goring-Morris and Gunesh Duru, who were out surveying, looking initially for earlier sites. We were hoping to find something epipaleolithic. But instead, they came across this very interesting site near a wetland. And it dates, like I said, to around 7,900, 8,200. So it's contemporaneous with parts, certainly level 4, parts of level 3, and even parts of level 5 at Ashukla, which are the lower, most of the lower layers, though it's not quite as old. There's some dates at Ashukla that are slightly, maybe 100, 150 years younger. And it's a really interesting site because it's because it's so different. Here we get those round structures that are like pit houses. And there are many of them. It's not a tell. There's no more than 2.5 or so meters of sediments, but we do have remodeling and reoccupation of the various structures, okay? And so we're really interested in, comparing this site to Ashukla and thinking about, why did these sites look so different? What are the differences in detail? This is an ongoing excavation, so we're working on this now. But also, why is it that it looks like some things got started in Ashukla but did not get started in Belikla? What was it about the dynamics in these two sites, the social dynamics, the economic dynamics, all of these things together that created this difference? And this is really important when we're thinking about multivariate scenarios of the beginning of animal domestication or plant domestication as well. So the analysis is in progress, but we have 5,500 data points collected over the last few years. And I'm going to show you again a little bit about the animals. Actually, I think I'll start with this slide, which basically what I did was I just stuck the Belikla bar, okay, down here. I hope you can see it, at the bottom of this Ashukla graph, so you can sort of see how it relates. And what you see is quite interesting because it almost looks like it belongs in the sequence, but slightly before, though I would not try to imagine that that's really what's happening. But certainly you have this large amount of small game, okay, which is mostly, interestingly enough, it's mostly hares, not as much fish as Ashukla, even though Belikla is the word for fish, so maybe misnamed. And we have a lot of other ungulates, okay, and a small amount of caprines compared to what we have here. So this is quite interesting. And if we look at I'm going to go back, in this case, you can focus on these 3 bars particularly. These are all the Central Anatolian sites that are relevant, but let's look at these sites particularly. This is Belikla, and the lowest and second lowest levels at Ashukla. And these are all of the bones that could be identified specifically to an ungulate taxa, though the yellow bar is sheep and goat combined. Okay, and what you see is the main differences are these large amounts of aurochs or wild cattle that we have at Belikla, and also large amount of wild ass. Okay, so very large animals that we certainly don't have evidence were domesticated, at least of the cattle, until quite a lot later. Okay, though we're looking to see now if at Ashukla maybe there's some management at the very end of the tell. Certainly we don't see any in the beginning. And we have the sheep and goat, but it's much less than what we see at Ashukla, okay, even in the contemporaneous layers. Both of these are contemporaneous. Okay, so again, it almost looks like what's happening before. So there's no question that at Belikla there's a lot of hunting going on. There's not just the cattle and the wild ass. There's also all of these hares, okay, but they also do have sheep and goat. Okay, so the question is, even though this definitely looks initially like a hunting and gathering economy, what might we be seeing in the sheep and goat? Now, because it's not a very big part of the assemblage and we still have 5,000 bones, we still are in the early stages of the work. But if you look again at this age data for the sheep and the goat, and you compare it to the equids, which we know aren't managed for sure, one of the things that's interesting early on, and this is called a survivorship curve, it basically tells you the percent of animals that survive to a different age. So nearly 100% made it to 6 months. I mean, it's really around 90 or something like that. But when you get down to, let's say, 18 to 48 month range for these sheep and goat, only about 50% are making it, okay? So remember, that's quite similar to what we are seeing at Ashukla, actually, in these layers. In addition, we see that there are some fetal and neonate bones, really, really young animals. At Ashukla, there's 8% of the sheep and goat animals that could be aged fall into this category, and at Belikla, it's 7. Okay, so it's similar, and you also note by comparing it to the other 3 ungulate species that there are very, very few fetal bones for the other taxa. So there's these interesting pieces or clues of information that are just hints right now that we have to investigate. We only have a few of the astragali to look at the lesions, but you can see that all three of them have like stage 2 and 3 pathologies. So basically, there's a lot more work to be done to investigate the question of management in this small piece of the story. So are we getting the inklings of a little bit of management here, or are we just dealing with a purely wild economy? Why is that? This is the main question, and so we need to do more micromorphology, we need to do genetic studies, we need to do isotopes. These are all things that we have planned for the next coming years to find out what's going to happen with Balikla. But it's very nice to see this scenario where we have very different situations happening very close to one another. So I guess I would wrap up that section by just saying that these different scenarios then really get, again, at the scenario of multivariate and local variation in a way that we can only get when we look at the very, very, very detailed scale. The work I've done in the southern Levant is not on the same scale. So I'm going to step back a little bit and show you a sequence of sites that I've worked on. Some were I collected the data from, some of my colleagues collected data from the others. And we've put them together into a sequence that looks from before agriculture, the Epi-Paleolithic periods, into the early Neolithic to see if we can see anything interesting or similar. And I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs from that work, but just so you know where these sites are coming from. These are 16 faunal assemblages that come from 11 sites. Some of those sites, of course, have multiple periods represented, so that's why we have more assemblages than sites. And these are all located in the Mediterranean zone, okay, of this region. Now, another graph, and this one I want you to focus primarily on three things. What this graph is showing is three different measures of what we can call hunting intensity. And what I mean by hunting intensity is it's basically a basic cost benefits measure. It's the idea that if you're hunting more intensively, your cost benefits are lower. You're not getting as much food back for the energy you're putting into it. And if you're hunting more cost effectively, then you're getting more food back for what you hunt. So if you went out and just hunted the biggest animals for the least cost, then you would be very efficiently or not intensively hunting, okay? And I'm looking at this in three different indicators, and I'll get back to why in a second, but I want you to look at these three graphs. One looks at the percentage of gazelle, which is the smallest ungulate out of all of the hoofed animals, the big animals that they're hunting. One looks at the percentage of small game that they're hunting out of the entire assemblage, so you'll recognize these ideas from the other sites. And one looks at the percentage of young animals in terms of the gazelles. And what you see here, this is the border between the Epi-Paleolithic and the Neolithic, okay, this line. But what you see is the pattern doesn't cross, it doesn't divide nicely at that line, right? You see in the two lower bars, you have less intensive hunting. And in the middle, with these are Natufian or late Epi-Paleolithic assemblages, and the very earliest Neolithic, you have a much more intensive scenario. And what is happening there is this is when people are starting to settle down, okay, into more permanent communities for much longer parts of the year. And at that time, they often change their dietary strategy. They often start are more willing to take a broader array of animals because of the fact that they stay in one place, and so they're hunting the animals around the site, and those animals eventually get slightly depleted, so they have to go further to get their food, so they get more willing to take smaller animals. So we see this increase in hunting intensity happening throughout this period, but then when we get into the next early pre-pottery Neolithic B periods, we see a shift and it goes back in the other direction. Okay, so why does this kind of get relieved, this more intensive hunting that we see in this period with sedentism? These guys are still sedentary, okay? They're sedentary occupants. They're living in the site more or less permanently. So if we divide it again by just those major ungulate species and look at this over time, and these represent, the dashed lines in this case represent those groups that I showed you, the two on the bottom, the three in the middle with the hunting intensity, we see, and there's a few other Paleolithic assemblages in here just to show this pattern, we see that earlier we have a lot a lot more diverse animals, a lot of larger animals, okay? These are the small ungulates in red, or the gazelles in red. And then when we get into that middle part where we have the more intensive hunting, we go to just about entirely gazelles. All of these other animals drop out of the picture, these bigger animals, okay? And we're focusing only on the small ones. But what I think is really interesting about this pattern is right here in the EPPMB, which is where things shifted in the other graph, we see new species entering, okay? Animals that are always there, they're not completely new, they're always there, they're always present in this region throughout, the wild boar, the wild cattle, and the wild goat. But all of a sudden, starting in the EPPNB, right when this hunting pressure starts to dive down, we get this increase in the animals, all of which are ultimately domesticated, okay? Those are the 3 domesticates, and they're local. We don't have any sheep here because the sheep didn't live in this region at this time period. They weren't native to that region. So this is really interesting because it looks like these animals, then these domestic animals that are ultimately domestic, I'm not saying they're domestic now, but people have recognized their importance and are starting to use them. And if we go forward in time, we see that the sheep come in the next period, and these numbers increase dramatically, and sheep ultimately become the most common. Okay, so in this case, what it looks like to me in these graphs is that we are getting interesting early signs. If we really look at it carefully and we don't focus so much on the bones themselves and if they have gone through changes showing full domestication, but we try to get at changes in the relationship between the animals or the way humans are using animals, then we start to see these glimmers of change happening in this data that suggests that we have evidence of some kind of change in human relationships where they're recognizing the value of these particular species. These are ones that can be managed in ways that the other species are not effective domesticates. People have tried and failed with deer and gazelle. So this is early. It's as early, again, these little glimmers are as early as what we see in the north, for goat at least, and for a little bit for pig and cattle, though there's no signs that they really get managed until later. And it's interesting to think about whether this is a local phenomenon or not. And I do believe that if we combine this with other data, like the fact that there are no sheep showing up here, the other hypothesis is that these have come in from the north, okay, that they've been domesticated in the core area, right? And domestication is moving down. Those domestic animals are moving down. But this scenario doesn't look like that because they come in very gradually, and the sheep, which is also part of that Neolithic package according to the core area model, are not arriving at all. They're not local here, but they don't move in until later. Okay, so it looks like before that happens, we have some signs of things starting to change. And if we look at some of those assemblages from some of those sites that date to that later period, we see that they also have, there's a lot of variability in what you see. It's not like everyone's doing the same thing. In some cases, there's this pattern toward more juvenile culling, but not all. In some, you have slightly smaller animals, but in others you have larger animals. There's a lot of variability in the assemblages themselves if you actually look at the goat component of the story where you have big enough samples to examine it. So this is another scenario where it looks like you potentially, and Leora Horowitz has been arguing for this for many years, but I think that the evidence is mounting to support another line of activity in the southern Levant as well as in Central Anatolia for local stirrings of animal management. So I think I just summarized that. Well, let me just say, so I think the picture then for Southwest Asia overall, when we look at Central Anatolia and we look at the southern Levant and we compare it to this supposed core area, is quite compelling that we have other things going on across this area. It doesn't necessarily mean that the same process happened in both of these areas. They happen differently. It happens at slightly different times. There's variability within the sites. There are local conditions that are acting that are creating these different scenarios. And I think that the data is supportive of a much more multivariate scenario than what has been proposed in the past, and not of a scenario of like a core-periphery movement in this case. But now I'm going to skip ahead because I want to make sure I talk also about my work in Greece while I'm here, and it's sort of a later piece of the story. And it is, there is a jump here, because during the time between where I left you, which was sort of at the beginning of the story of the beginning of the emergence of animal domestication, we get more, as time progresses, the signs of domestication, eventually get very clear in the Southwest Asia, and we see evidence for, fully domestic economies emerging in these early agricultural sites. So by the time we get to Franchthi Cave and the beginning of the Neolithic there, and the beginning of agriculture, it's later. The Neolithic just starts later there. It starts at 7,000 BC. So I'm going to tell you, I guess I should also say that nevertheless, there's also been a lot of debate and interest about how agricultural economies and societies emerge here as well, just like there has been in Southwest Asia. And there's been many scenarios through the years with, from local domestication to local adoption by local populations of agriculture from Southwest Asia, as well as full-scale colonization or people bringing agriculture there. And if you look in different places, you can see different kinds of evidence. And the site of Franchthi Cave, which I'm going to talk about today, is really interesting because the site has been used to argue for all of those scenarios at different times. Okay, so this is the first full study of I won't say full because it's a huge assemblage. There's like more than 100,000 fragments of bones from Franchthi, very small ones, many of them. But it's the first one that sort of goes and samples the entire sequence. And the site is interesting because it's got a very long sequence. And we are just going to bite off a little bit of that to talk about this idea of the end of the Epipaleolithic and the very beginning of the Neolithic, because this is one of the very few sites where you actually get both. So if you want to talk about how did agriculture begin here or how did domestication emerge, then this is a good site to do it because of the fact that you have the very final end of the Epipaleolithic, which is called Mesolithic here and in other parts of Europe, and you also have the very beginning of the Neolithic. But there is a little gap of 200 years, okay? So it's important to keep that in mind. So the site is a huge, beautiful limestone cave. I don't know if many of you have been there, but you can, they've done a great job making it accessible to the public now. It's really worth a visit. It's beautiful and impressive. And inside they excavated back in the late 60s to about 78. It was led by Jacobson, who was digging on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania and the American School. And he was a classicist, and he was waiting for his permit when he started doing Franchthi, and he dug it beautifully. It's really one of the earliest excavations that have water screening, every little fragment from the smallest mesh. They screened it right out in the sea in front of the cave. So the recovery is very, very good. And so I've showed you this slide just to give you an idea of what the sequences look like. The deposits go all the way back to the Upper Paleolithic, up to 39,000 years ago, and they go all the way through the Neolithic later than that. It's a beautiful sequence, but we're going to focus just on this little piece of it. I tried to block it off so you could sort of see what we're dealing with here. And some of the other trenches are even deeper than this one. These are the two trenches we discuss here, FAS and FAN, are the ones that have the biggest samples of Neolithic earliest Neolithic and latest Mesolithic material, which is why we chose them. And just to also mention, the dating of the final Mesolithic is around 75 to 7,000, and the Neolithic is around 7,000 to 65. So it's about 1,000 years later than what we're talking about in the southern Levant, at least. So I just had to show you how well recovered the bones are. It took a long time to go through all of the details. The Mesolithic layer was extremely rich and full of fauna. So we also looked carefully at the bone fragments for burning and other kinds of information. But in the end of the day, the sample from this small part of the sequence of these two periods is about 6,000 or so, if we combine the two trenches together where they have the same basic sequence of layers. And what we did here then, as you're going to start recognizing these kind of graphs, so that's why I thought I could get away with so many of them. So what we see here is different animals, but kind of a similar pattern, but a little bit different. The final the site was dug in these units, and I'm going to go back here for 1 second. These are all units. You can't really see them, but they have numbers and descriptions on them. And they're not all completely in order chronologically, because sometimes they moved side to side within the sequence, but in general, they're in chronological order. So that's what's so wonderful about the sequence. You don't just look at the final Mesolithic, you can also look at fine scale changes that go through it. And so what we see here in Trench FAN, which was the one that preserved a better sequence, and I'm going to start here with the ungulate part of the story this time, is that the main species that they were eating in the Mesolithic was red deer, okay, in terms of the large species right here. And then you shift over here to caprines, which are sheep and goat, okay? You have a little bit of caprine here, right? Sheep and goat. Do you see the little gray pieces? There are goats present, but not sheep, okay? And when you go up here, it's the absolute opposite, right? It's all caprines and just a couple little deer sort of appearing here and there. So we have a real flip in this case, more than a transition. And I'm going to talk about these mixed units in a second, because they're an important piece of the story. In the small game fauna, you have a similar kind of pattern. The Mesolithic layers at the site are extremely diverse. There are a lot of different taxa represented. And not only do you have, again, hares and some other terrestrial things and freshwater turtles and birds and tortoises, but you have a lot of fish, okay? By this time, the sea level has raised enough that the sea is very close to the cave. And so they're doing a lot of fishing. And the stippled bar is fish, okay? But when you get, again, up into these initial Neolithic layers, the fish disappear. You can see there's still some hares, but the fish have disappeared. There's still some carnivores, foxes mostly, things like that. So you have a flip again in terms of the numbers. The mixed units I've put in for full disclosure, because when you look at these, you have, these ones, in the small game, they look more like the initial Neolithic, and here the same. But what's important about these is when we were given the list of units that we could analyze by Catherine Perles and Katie Vitelli, who did a very, very detailed work, and also Bill Farrand, who did the litho sequence here, they identified these as what are called mixed units. It's not that they're not transitional units. They're units that came and excavated, they missed the transition between the two units, and they excavated from both layers. So there's actually a discontinuity between the two layers. The final Mesolithic and the initial Mesolithic, there was an erosional period in the cave, and I said there was a hiatus. Farron thought it was around 300 to 600 years, but when Perles redated the cave with Katarina Duca about 10 years ago, or maybe it was already 15 years ago. I should think better. They said 100 to 200 years. Okay, so these are not transitional units. These are units that were excavated and included material from both layers, and therefore they're called mixed. And we went back to the field notes and everything to, from the 70s to read about it, and it was clearly described there. So there doesn't seem to be a transition of some kind in this area. It's just a combination of the two. Okay, so what it looks like from this data is that we have quite a clear change. And even if we have 100 and 200 years between, it's not a lot of time to have this kind of a level of change, especially when you think about the fish, I think, disappearing, though they do come in a little bit later in the Neolithic sequence. People start fishing again, but not nearly to the degree that they did in the earlier levels. I'm just going to look at the caprines again to compare them from now what you know about how you can tell if they're domestic or not. And what we can see is in the survivorship curve again, you can see that there's even more juveniles, right? They drop off here to the 24-month mark, which is 2 years, and this is when they become adults. There's actually only 20% of the animals are even making it past into adulthood, which is about 4 years of age, which is quite surprising. We also looked at the teeth, and you can see that a lot of them, it shows a lot of them dying, a lot of the teeth from 6 to 12 months. And we also looked and found shed teeth, like the teeth, the baby teeth that fell out. There was a lot of those teeth as well, which again is a nice evidence for confinement, right? The idea that if you're confined in the cave, which is a great place to keep your flocks for part of the year, that the teeth will fall out naturally and become part of the cave deposits. So this is another piece of the story here. The last piece is a piece about their body size, and I'm not going to try to explain all this graph in huge detail other than to say that the dots here and the scale represent the sort of average body size of the population of different sites. When we come more to this size, the bones are bigger, okay? Not just the fragments, but the actual bones themselves based on measurements of complete parts of the bones. And when we come more on this side, okay, the bones are smaller. So what you see is this group of sites are all from Southwest Asia. Most of these are from the northern Levant and also from Cyprus. And what we see is this is the time period that we just talked about in our other sequence, okay? Early on in the domestication process, though some of these samples are later. So you can see they're slowly getting bigger. But these samples from Franchthi and from these Western Anatolian sites are way smaller. It's really a dramatic change. They're very small. And this is what I would say, if we look at those two things together, is what we would consider a fully domesticated herd of sheep and goats, from the culling that we see and the very young culling that we see and the very small body size of the animals. So here at Franchthi, the story looks quite different. If we look at it at face value, it looks like quite a dramatic change. And if we look at the plant part of the story, we also see a dramatic change between the final Mesolithic, where we have wild oats, and the initial Neolithic, where we get two-row barley and emmer wheat coming in, okay, also not native plants. So we also note that sheep become very abundant in the initial Neolithic. The percentage of sheep to goat is 3 to 1, but there are no sheep in the Mesolithic. Okay, so this is a huge piece of the story, that these are not native animals to this region before then. So certainly agriculture was adopted as a package in the initial Neolithic. And the question is about whether that was local adoption. Some of that could have been local adoption, right? Because we know people were living here for a long time, though the final Mesolithic deposits show a sparser, less intensive occupation than earlier layers, especially in the late and early Mesolithic, or if it's colonists coming to the region. We know that at this time they certainly were good seafarers, right? We have obsidian trade in Greece already in the Mesolithic, from the island of Milos. Okay, so shows that they had good ability to navigate the waters. So if these are populations of people coming from elsewhere with their Neolithic society already sort of established, then it's possible that they could have come like Cyprus, and then eventually they come to Crete around the same time. And Franchthi is really kind of an isolated site down there on the very bottom of the Peloponnese for the very beginning of the Neolithic. There's a lot more sites that appear around the same time, like slightly later in the plains of Thessaly, right? And but if that could have come from a different route. I wouldn't assume necessarily it's the same. It really has to be independently assessed for that region itself. I think that the data is quite compelling for a more a population arriving with agriculture, given especially the short time frame that we're talking about here. But there are a few indications that Catherine Perles thinks are suggestive of the lithic assemblage that might indicate that there was some local adoption initially, and then later a larger population replacement. Those are the two hypotheses that are out. We argue in our paper for people arriving with agriculture at this point in time. So we have a different picture here, but what's interesting about Europe is that it's not uniform. Different scenarios of the arrival of agriculture are happening in different places. So you have also a more multi-regional kind of story, but often the package and the genetics and everything show that those domestic plants and animals do originate in Southwest Asia. So I think that I actually managed to go through all the slides and promised that I would get to my very detailed acknowledgement slide, which I usually forget to do at the very end. So thank you for your attention, and appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's a great talk, a very fascinating topic, and what you have said, it shows some new, let's say, scenarios of how domesticated happened. I think we can take some questions.
Hello, and thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I found the part about the urine salts amazing, but I was slightly confused. Can you tell apart the human urine salts from animal urine salts? Is there some chemical procedure that can distinguish?
Right, that's a good question, because there are similarities in the salts that appear in urine in those different groups of animals, and these three ones that they measure particularly would be present in both. So if you read the paper, and this is not my work, I'm not a specialist in urine, but if you read the paper, you'll see that they model the populations. They sort of estimate like how many people could have really lived here at the site based on the amount of salts that they find and the concentrations they find in the sediments. And they look at that over time. And what's really interesting is the fact that it goes up exponentially, right? So even though it's not that high at the beginning, it gets higher later. So the dung, you can certainly tell the difference between animals and people, but with the urine salts, it's more tricky, which is why they invested in that modeling part, and were very convinced by the result that it could not just be humans, there would have to be other contributor.
Okay, thank you. That's amazing. Thanks a lot.
I also have to compliment you on the excellent delivery, obviously the content as well, but the delivery was amazing. A concept that personally fascinates me and troubles me is attributing intentionality. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to that at the beginning of your talk, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that. How would you, especially in the very early cases of domestication, how would you envision that, like intentionality in itself, or linked to, say, adversity, like weather, environmental adversities, other causes that might co-occur? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we can sort of think about it from a few different directions, I guess. And one is, I guess, as you say, intentionality. If you mean with a vision toward what's going to happen, like not maybe quite the final product, but the idea of really domestication, or not. And I don't think people did it with this sort of long-term vision in mind. I think that they were resolving a problem for the time, or taking advantage of a situation at the time that it happened. So there was a recognition that, or a need to, or became just more convenient or helpful, especially with a Shuklahuyuk, where we know they have these domestic plants, even though they're not the dominant plants from the very beginning. So it's likely that they even moved to that particular location, which was so good for agriculture, knowing that they were going to plant plants. Maybe then the animals, it became an easier thing to do if they were more permanent, to bring the animals to them initially. But I think from this nice trajectory of different strategies of the animal use, it shows that they changed the way they did it over time. So I don't think they envisioned that 1,000-year trajectory. I think that they first did this, and then, they saw how that went, and then, and they weren't doing that trying to see how it went, it just was what they did. And then eventually they recognized that another strategy, a change in the strategy would work. So I don't see it as, I see it as intentional. They very much did it on purpose, but they didn't necessarily envision the entire scenario of the trajectory. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I noticed that many of the changes you showed happened around 9.2 BP, 7000 BC, and I was wondering whether we could imagine that these are different adaptation strategies related to the 9.2 rapid climate change, that it's poorly understood yet, that was not in a big scale as the 8.2, but I was wondering whether these two could be linked one to the other.
Great question. If we look at it where the 8.2 happens in those sequences, it actually happens after those changes. So even like at Şıklıhöyük, we don't have, so far we don't have, well, we haven't done a huge amount of paleo-environmental work, but we don't have any sign of climatic stress or anything like that. And certainly when they settled there, it would have been before that would have happened. And the same goes for the trajectory in the Levant, because the 8.2 event is really at the end of the sequence that I showed you. It happens at the end of the pre-pottery Neolithic. And actually, that's when you get to, that's really one of the major, I'm not saying that's why, but it's one of the timing of that event sort of ends, it sort of corresponds roughly to the end of the PPN and the beginning of the pottery Neolithic. So the sequence I showed just ended just before that happened. Franchthi is later, but I'm not convinced that this is a driving factor in any of those things, despite the fact that we do have a climatic event happening in the ballpark. But I think that in Southwest Asia it's starting earlier.
Okay, I think we have a few questions from the web. Yeah.
Maylin Sarah says, hi, thank you very much for the talk. What aspects do pathology on joints of sheep and goat indicates? Is it the types of domestication? Are they caused by repetitive strain or confinements? Or are they due to dietary aspects? And whether you see an evolution of these pathologies, like a change over time as practices in domestication change?
Great questions. Yeah, so it looks like the pathologies, we believe that it's related to confinement. At least that's the variable that we checked from collections that were available to allow us to separate them. And the idea is that, when animals are confined in a small space, especially an uneven space, like if you have a lot of dung that's getting wet with urine and other things, it becomes uneven and they sink in, and the way their joints will move habitually over the period of times where they're there can show different kinds of wear than it might if they're free-ranging. So there's quite a bit of work that's been done, especially in earlier periods, like a field called ecomorphology that really looks to see if bones change their shape in response to different kinds of things like mobility. And it's a little bit similar to that, but in this case, we're focusing specifically on the confinement issue. So so the idea is that confinement itself caused the lesions. There in the graph that I showed, there is they look at the sort of the bottom of the tail, and then they look in the middle and the later, and what you see is a bit of a drop off in the later layers. It increases, which is what we expect, and then it decreases in the top. And I didn't really talk about that, but at the top of Şıklıhöyük, if you remember the plan, the houses are all really close together. There's no open spaces. And we think that at that time that they probably moved the animals off the tell and started having herds maybe around the site. And if we look, for example, at the isotope values that were studied by Joris Peters, and at the pathology data, they also reflect that. And so the dietary piece suggests more ranging, more mobility at that time than it did before. And the pathology data suggests that as well. So.
There is one more question. why can we not domesticate deer? Like, for example, why sheep and goat? Why not other types?
It's a great question too. Yeah, I've thought a lot about that because I worked a lot with gazelles. They're not deer, but they also you could see in the Levantine sequence they were eating them like for millennia, and they were really focusing on them before they started domestication. So they were very familiar with them and their habits. But there are qualities that make animals good domesticates. And deer and gazelle lack some of those qualities. So for example, deer are, the way that they tend to mate, the males are very territorial, and they don't really get along well with other males, and they also are quite skittish. But gazelles especially are very skittish. Like, it's very difficult to get up close to them. They're panickers. They really get alarmed and stressed. And so they just don't work well in sort of human environments, whereas sheep and goat, they have, they just have qualities that enable them to be successful domesticates. They're more relaxed. They also work really well in herds together because the sheep are more followers and the goats tend to take the lead, and that often you see that a few goats in your herd of sheep is actually an advantageous thing. But they also have, so I think there's like 8 or 9 qualities that you could probably list that sheep and goat have all of them, and gazelles maybe have half of them, but they miss a few or others, and the same with the deer. So that's why. But they did eventually succeed a little bit with reindeer, but they're still considered, I think people consider them sort of half domesticated because their behavioral qualities were not as moldable as sheep and goat.
Do you have any other question? Over there.
How about pigs? You didn't mention pigs' presence or any findings that pigs was being taken as food in that region. Is that was that pigs were not being consumed in that region?
Are you saying pets? Is that
pigs?
Oh, pests. Pigs. I apologize. The acoustics from here. Pigs. Yeah. So pigs were there. Yep. It's interesting. They're there from the beginning. They're hunting wild boar all throughout these sequences. And if you look at Central Anatolia, for example, one of the sites, there's Bonchuklu, which is in the Konya plain near Çatalhöyük. It has huge numbers of wild boar that they're eating there. So pigs are part of the story, but they're after the story that I told. So it's the same with the cattle. Like the sheep and the goat do have suggestions of being earlier, though if you went into also southeastern Anatolia, where you have a lot of pig. They're really, really one of the dominant animals. It's possible there that you're getting more action with the pigs. But in the 3 areas where I'm working, they're just not very common compared to the other species. So probably later more is going on. They're definitely using them throughout.
Okay, I just want, it's not a question, but I want to discuss something, your opinion. So what we see is, let's say, after people settle down somewhere, so sedentaries become more sedentary, eventually, one way or another, they domesticate animals, they domesticate plants, they do other technical innovations like pottery, other pyrotechnological inventions, metallurgy. So the question remains why people settle down, because all this happens after. So they settle down on purpose for doing all this? I guess no. So what do you think about what is, let's say, the trigger behind?
Yeah, I mean, this is That's a more difficult question in a lot of ways because it's easy to oversimplify, I guess. And if I want to give you a nice answer, it will be an oversimplification. I do think that populations are, I'm not going to say it's all about population, I really think it's much more complex, but I do think that you have to have thresholds in terms of population sizes, that it eventually becomes efficient to settle down. I think that people are mobile because it's the best strategy, and they only settle down when it becomes better to settle down because the amount of movement you have to do to obtain animals for a larger population just outweighs the cost of staying in one place. So once it becomes, once especially people get to the point where they're willing to take all those small animals, fishing and everything, which are more cost invested strategies, I believe that it makes sense. Once they get to that point, it makes sense to settle down because then they start to actually get a lot. Once you accept those animals and you reduce your cost efficiency, then you actually get you open up doors to a huge food supply. And I think agriculture works in a very similar way. Now, of course, once people settle down, they change their habitats, they modify things, and they act in ways to improve their access to foods in that scenario as well. So I'm sure that this happens too. But I really believe that we're sedentary, so we think about sedentism as a positive thing. It's like, or a goal of humans, but I don't think it is. I think that being mobile is actually makes sense in times when your food moved and it was more efficient and more cost effective to move with it. That's a very oversimplified answer. Yeah. I'll get in trouble for it later, I'm sure.
Okay, I think that it's time to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And please join us for a drink downstairs and you can talk more if you want.